I'm Dr. Dave Janda. Welcome back to our combined series of Operation Freedom Briefing and Dave versus the MSM. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for networking this information to all those you know and love because, 99.9% of them have no idea about what we're going to talk about today, and they don't even realize what's really happening in the world. And it's not because they're ignorant or dumb or unengaged. They think that they're on top of things because they go to the bought-off lamestream fake media and consume their, not news, not truth, not facts, not data, but their propaganda. And that's the plan. Because the syndicate, the globalist syndicate, the globalist scum, the New World Order crowd, the criminal international banking syndicate, the shadow government, the deep state, it's all the same. Their success relies on keeping billions of people misinformed, disinformed, and completely uninformed because it makes them an easier target to strip them of their remaining freedoms and liberties. And that's our mission. That's our goal. To try to help and save as many people as possible. Save them by providing them the nourishment of truth, facts, data, and when needed, the science. Today I want to talk about what the globalists have focused on for hundreds of years. Power, control, and getting more financial resources through shaking the chaos jar. Shaking the chaos jar. This was sent to me recently, and it was an observation from someone by the name of Shira Starr. Tell me if this sounds familiar. If you catch 100 red ants, and as well as 100 large black ants, and put them in a jar, at first, nothing will happen. However, if you violently shake the jar and dump them back on the ground, the ants will fight amongst themselves until they eventually kill each other. The thing is, the red ants think the black ants are the enemy and vice versa, when in reality, the real enemy is the person or entity who shook the jar. And who shakes the jar in our world? The globalist syndicate. She goes on, this is exactly what's happening in society today. It is. The real question we need to be asking ourselves is, who's shaking the jar and why? Well, let me give you the Reader's Digest versions. It's the globalist syndicate. And we tend to focus some of our efforts on the puppets, all those in federal, state, local government, all those in the private sector, that have focused on the oppression side of the axis. But in fact, they're just taking their marching orders from the banking syndicate. And in particular, at the very top of that pyramid are the banking families. One more time, they hate this when I do it, which is why I really like doing it. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Lazards, the Pinkases, the Warburgs, the Seifs, the Loebs, and the very top of the pyramid, the Payseur, P-A-Y-S-E-U-R family. But they're all about dividing and conquering, essentially. The ants, the shaking of the jar. That's what it's all about. Shake, 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 shake. Fight amongst yourselves. Great. And we get more power, control, and financial resources. We being them, the globalists. And they shake the jar in many different ways. Up, down, back and forth, sideways, right side, left side, right. Let's talk about how the ways in which they shake the jar. One way they shake the jar is with their hired thugs. Yeah, they're puppets in the federal, state, and many times local governments and in the private sector. But also it's their thugs on the street. Recently there was a meeting held by President Trump and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth at Quantico. And they brought in the 800 admirals and generals from around the world for this meeting. One of the purposes of the meeting was to define the enemy. Remember, enemies, foreign and domestic. In particular, the closed door session, if you will. was about the domestic enemies. And here's what President Trump said. Again, this is about identifying who's shaking the jar and making sure that that jar shaking of chaos stops. President Trump said the military's core mission is supposed to be, quote, defending the homeland, end quote, and not policing the globe. Hear, hear. America first, right? Yeah. He then said, we are, quote, under invasion from within by a uniformless domestic enemy, end quote. Yes, and that domestic enemy, as we'll get into, it takes on many forms. But the key is identification of this domestic enemy. Not just foreign. No, they're there, but not just foreign. So they shake the jar, and with their street thugs. We saw this in the summer of love in 2020, right? Buildings burning, riots, people senselessly losing their businesses, losing their communities, losing their lives in some respect. It's all planned. It's all part of shaking the jar. Another way they shake the jar is with fraudulent, bogus election events. And one way to stop the shaking of the jar is to ensure honest, transparent elections. You know, we've gone into great depth on this platform about election integrity. Recently, we posted an interview I did with Senator Pat Colbeck, one of the top election integrity experts in the country, if not world. And in particular, we spoke about that when fraud occurs, it's multifactorial on multiple levels. So one way is to identify who's shaking the jar on these fraud voting operations. A lot of times it's these NGOs, non-government organizations, that are getting money not just from the private sector, but actually getting our taxpayer money to undermine us and create more shaking of the jar on the election front. And some of the entities we've discussed about ways of dealing with this is undermining the financial support of these NGOs and these operations. Voter roll integrity programs. Ending mail-in voting. You know, the studies have shown that 20% of mail-in votes are fraudulent. That might be an underestimate, but that's what the studies show. To ensure the chain of custody of ballots. Sticking with paper ballots and not these machines that we know can be, well, right down the street, a guy from me, from the University of Michigan, professor of computer engineering, J. Alex Halderman, went into a courtroom in Atlanta a couple years ago, a year and a half, 2 years ago, and they had a voting machine from the 2020 election in Georgia. And in real time, in front of the judge, her last name was Totenberg. Her sister works at NPR. In real time, he hacked the machine and changed the votes in front of her without him touching the machine. Purportedly, it took her breath away. Yeah, well, truth hurts. So, paper ballots. Take the electronic voting machines seem like a great idea, but guess what? We got a problem, Houston. And hand counting of ballots, because even the tabulators can be fooled with. Now, there was a step recently in the, many people believe, right, no pun intended, direction, when Dominion Voting was bought out and renamed in an effort to restore trust to vulnerable electronic voting systems. This from the Conservative News Daily. Dominion Voting Systems has been acquired by Scott Leindecker, a Republican and former St. Louis elections director, and renamed Liberty Vote. This immediately, all those people that said, you know, what happened in 2020, that the machines couldn't have been fooled with, all of a sudden, oh, this can't happen, this is bad. Why? Well, machines can be tampered. Well, wait a minute. You said all of us that were saying that we're conspiracy theorists and we should be thrown off of everything. Yeah, okay. Leyendecker aims to rebuild public trust by emphasizing paper-based ballots, transparency, security, and simplicity in elections. Boy, does that sound like a recipe to to putting the jar down rather than shaking it, huh? Dominion Voting Systems, newly acquired by a former GOP elections official, is moving to drop its $1.6 billion defamation suit against One America News, and also plans to eliminate the remaining litigation with Mike Lindell, Rudy Giuliani, and Sidney Powell. Well, this is great. I do have a question, though. Reportedly, the sale price was like $780 million. Where did this Leyendecker cat get that money? Where did that come from? Let's just make sure everything's on the up and not just a little bit of a smoke and mirror show. Where did he get that money? We need to find that out yet. But this could be a very big step in the right direction. And let's make sure that he ends those other lawsuits for people just utilizing their First Amendment rights of saying, there's a question here. So, one way to stop shaking the jar and letting the globalists induce chaos like we saw in 2020 and in years prior, and they're always trying to mess with the election jar, is more honest, straightforward, well-documented, above-board elections so that they can't install their puppets. And while we're at it, let's make sure that these NGOs, as I mentioned, not just the NGOs that are support. Remember, the NGOs do a lot of nefarious activities. They can do some good things, but unfortunately, they've been essentially hijacked. NGOs were really the mechanism of which the vast majority of the illegal immigration occurred and the human trafficking occurred. That's true. Sad, but true. And we've been documented in our platform with the assistance of a regular guest in our platform, Dr. Karlin Borshenko, about how these NGOs are involved in, well, chaotic, at times violent activities. In fact, Karlin Borshenko recently infiltrated some Antifa clubs. And again, one of the mechanisms of taking down these clubs is to adversely affect their funding. It turns out that there are studies that show that through the Government Accountability Institute, the entities such as the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, oh, there's that name again, Arabella, Soros, Tides Foundations, are at the heart of this, along with the Democratic Socialists of America. If that sounds familiar, well, they're the ones who, well, their candidate for New York mayor is Mamdani. Yeah. From Jason Curtis. And of his mask slip, Trump recently had a roundtable send shadow NGO network behind, quote, Riot Incorporated. President Trump's latest roundtable on Antifa wasn't just a political statement. It was long overdue reckoning against rising far-left globalist political violence and jar shaking. The president's meeting revealed Antifa is only one mask worn by a much larger monster, a transnational network of NGOs, foreign financiers, and ideological operatives quietly fueling what's been called Riot Incorporated. The Government Accountability Institute exposed how left-wing extremism has evolved from decentralized networks of anarchist collectives into a well-funded infrastructure with global ambitions. For example, they funnel money to American-based protest groups doing the bidding of the Chinese Communist Party, and it's been well documented. There are deep connections between Antifa networks and Democratic Socialists of America, as outlined by Jason Curtis. Arabella Advisors, the same dark money network behind some of the most powerful progressive operations in Washington, Their fingerprints are all over Riot Incorporated, and it's a product not of grassroots passion, but of elite engineering, managed, funded, and protected by a nonprofit industrial complex that answers to no voters and fears no audits. The government protest industry, he states, has thousands of nonprofit entities, shell companies, fiscal sponsorships, alternative media arms, an army of lawyers, bail funds, foreign influencers, and multi-billion-dollar network of backers. In fact, Karlin Borchenko has pointed that out, that at many of these Antifa events, they have these green hat people who are in fact lawyers. And they are the ones who should be looked into through their bar associations. And if they're involved in subversive activities, that's a violation of their ethical code of conduct. I know lawyers and ethical code of conduct don't exactly, it seem to be like oil and water, but nonetheless, if they are, in fact, involved in domestic chaos and shaking the jar, they should be disbarred. Period. Easy case to make. President Trump recently said in an Oval Office event, quote, "It's going to get worse and ultimately it's going to go back on them. I mean, bad things happen when they play these games. It gets worse. It'll be a point where other people won't take it anymore, and that won't be good for the radicals." In fact, President Trump has given the country a huge heads up. He's signaling counterintelligence has picked up more terror operations domestically, which will lead to the use of possibly more overt military intervention, hence the meeting in Quantico. And these entities, these jar-shaking entities, surely do not want America or Americans to succeed. And one of the ways they cause more chaos and more jar-shaking is by trying to censor and target people that are bringing to light facts, data, truth, and when needed, science. That happens on this platform. We are constantly targeted by the globalist scum that they are. It's why you don't get notifications on my videos. It's why they suppress view counts, why they suppress likes, why they, no. They think that if they can censor people, they can shake the jar even more and harder, create more turmoil. And what happened on September 10th in Utah with Charlie Kirk was, I believe, an event that will fall, if the truth really does come out, at the hands of the globalists, the syndicate. And I have to be careful what I say, right? But one of the goals of the perpetrators, plural, many plural, by the way, was to induce societal chaos. They were trying to recreate what happened in 2020 with George Floyd. They were hoping that with the death of Charlie Kirk, his supporters and followers would lash out as the left globalists did in 2020. That there would be riots and burning buildings and murders and law enforcement officers injured and harmed and in some cases killed. But that didn't happen. It boomeranged on them. Because, well, Charlie Kirk's followers were not consumed by hate. They didn't buy into propaganda. They knew something smelled. It was horrible Charlie died. And they turned to prayer vigils and looking to hold perpetrators plural, many plural, accountable, which the public is made more inroads into the investigation than we see out of our own government. I believe that's not a mistake. One of the other ways they love to shake the jar, big time shaking, is through the implementation of war. Behind all the wars, go back to Smedley Butler, one of the most decorated Marines in U.S. history, wrote the book in 1935, War is a Racket, run by the banksters, to benefit the banksters. They do everything to induce war, the ultimate shaking of the jar. Which is why it took too long, but finally it happened. Nothing was happening with the previous installation operation with Biden and Harris. Actually, it was just made worse in Gaza. But October 13th was a big day when the first phases of the peace accord in Gaza, led by President Trump, were signed. Phase 1, a return of the 20 hostages from the West and Israel. In return, 250 Palestinians, another 1,700 down the line, would be returned to their homes. President Trump, when it was announced, said, what this means about this first phase is that all the hostages will be released and Israel will withdraw their troops to an agreed-upon line as the first steps toward a strong, durable, and everlasting peace. He went on, all parties will be treated fairly. This is a great day for the Arab and Muslim world, Israel, all surrounding nations, and the United States of America. And we thank the mediators from Qatar, Egypt, and Turkey who worked with us to make this historic and unprecedented event happen. Blessed are the peacemakers. End quote. Well, in spite of all the roadblocks thrown his way and all those negotiators' way, it happened. And on the 13th, the hostages on all sides of this equation went home. But that's the first phase. There's the second phase, and probably a third and fourth and fifth phase. And every one of those phases will be met with jar shaking by the syndicate. And it's important that we let all of our elected representatives know that we're wise to the jar shaking. We're wise to who's behind it. And if they allow it to happen, and if they don't step in the way of stopping it, they will also be held accountable, and we will vote them out of office in the next primary, or maybe even recall them. That really, really bothers them and frightens them. I know people don't think it works. Oh, it does. If they're getting enough phone calls from you and your neighbors and your coworkers about we're wise, we understand, we want peace, no more jar shaking, enough. On the 13th, President Trump proclaimed an end of the age of terror and death. The 20 were released, head back to Israel. The 250 with 1,700 more to come, released back home to the Palestinian region. President Trump took to the podium and said the following, quote, "This is not only the end of war, this is the end of the age of terror and death, and the beginning of the age of faith and hope and of God," end quote. Let's hope that's the case. But we have to hold everybody's feet to the fire, because the globalists will be there shaking the jar on all sides of the equation to make sure that an initial peace, let alone a lasting peace, is not achieved. Because peace does not bring the globalists power, control, or more financial resources. Peace brings you and me not just peace of mind, not just peace of life, but it brings us a bountiful future where wasted lives and wasted money go away. And we just have investments in people and in financial resources that benefit, don't kill society, which is what the syndicate wants. And finally, the way in which they shake the jar is by their 24/7 manipulation of the financial system. And just as there was peace breaking out, what did we see? The stock market hit for 900 points. The cryptocurrencies pummeled. The only things that were going up were gold and silver, true money, that don't have globalist debt, DEBT, associated with them, physical gold and physical silver. So to make sure that they didn't do well on that day, they threw huge amounts of fraudulent, unbacked paper contracts. They threw enough paper contracts at silver, trying to drive it down at least $10, because they didn't want these things standing the test of time where people would say, hey, that's doing okay, I'm going to get some of that. They threw paper contracts to the tune of 1 billion, with a B, 100,410,000 fake ounces of synthetic silver just in one trading session at it to try to drive its price down. Because they don't want you or me benefiting from owning the best store of value, the best financial insurance policies on the face of the earth. Physical gold, physical silver, stood the test of time for 5,000-6,000 years. But guess what? They shook that jar really hard. It didn't work. In spite of what they did criminally. Now, they tried, but they didn't succeed, because you know why? Because I can tell, I've been preaching this on the radio for 15 years about what I was taught by my dad. The best store of value is something that does not have debt, DEBT, associated with it. And what happened on that day is that folks that had listened to all the guests we have had on Operation Freedom about how you want an entity as an financial insurance policy that does not have counterparty risk associated with it, which is physical gold and physical silver. Over the years, they have accumulated some and actually done very, very well. But those that hadn't, when this started to hit, they said, uh-oh, the time is now. And they started to purchase some gold and silver, even though they're significantly higher in price. Because people realize that, it's like living in California. You have a beautiful home, and your home doesn't have any fire insurance on it. And one night, you look, and over the mountain ridge, you see orange. And then you see the trees on top of the ridge catching fire. And then you call your insurance agent and go, hey, I want that fire insurance on my house. Any particular reason why? Well, I just think I better get it. Well, that's what happened on October 13th. To negate the jar shaking that the syndicate tried to pull with their fraudulent paper contracts. So the best way to protect yourself with all this jar shaking is to be educated with the facts, the truth, the data, and when needed, the science, to put you ahead of the curve. So that when they shake the jar, if they see you as an ant, rather than fighting, you move away. You protect yourself. And the best way to protect yourself is know what's up. And that's what we provide on our platform. On the public side, I can only provide so much. In fact, tip of the iceberg stuff. Because we are so heavily censored and suppressed and targeted. I do have these channels on social media platforms, but I do it just to let folks know, those that can see us, that we're here and try to provide some information. But the real information, which is uncensored, unfiltered, is on our own protected platform, DaveJanda.com. We have a lot of free public information, but the real meat of the matter is on the subscription side. A mere $9 a month, 30 cents a day, for content that's worth, 100 times that, 1,000 times that, in some cases 1,000,000 times that. And we have a cost to it because it costs a lot of money to run a platform. Many thousands of dollars every month for the safety and security. We have our own servers, so they can't be shut down. We have our own IT team, so we're not vulnerable. So we protect our content and everybody who comes to our site. That takes a lot of money. On the radio side, I, again, can only go so far, not because of Wham. Wham's a great station, only station in the country where there's no restrictions on content. The problem is the FCC. I go beyond a certain point, the FCC steps in and shuts down Wham, and we don't want that. I hope you'll join us. Become part of our freedom team. Because if you do, I assure you, you will be less vulnerable to the shaking of the jar that is going on 24/7 by the globalist syndicate. I thank you for joining me today. Again, we're available 24/7 at DaveJanda.com. Until next time, Dave Janda signing off. Dream big and dare to fail. Thanks for your time today.